Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Hi, Mike. How are you this evening?
Hey, Barry, I'm good. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Let's get started, shall we? We're
Let's.
talking about Jodi Dean's blog theory, 2010 book blog theory tonight. And I mentioned the date because the date is, dates are usually important. We try to give a little bit of historical context for the theory articles and books media theory books and articles we discuss. But I think this episode might be somewhat unique in that I think we're going to talk a lot about the difference between 2010 in both media and media theory and 2024 in both media and media theory. And that's going to be one of the along with talking, of course, about Dean's book and her theory of the blog. I think inadvertently or along the way, we're going to talk a lot about where media theory was and is now, and where media technologies, particularly social media, was in 2010 and where it might be now, or where it may be headed.
Yeah, I think that this isn't, we talked about this the other day when we were sort of trying to figure out where to go with this. And the thing, I think it's right and important to make note that this is 2010, because in a way, and I mentioned to you this the other day, I feel like the book is either a little too early or a little too late in terms of comfortably fitting into the discussions that we would normally have around this. You know, we had done the Ken Brunzilinska book.
2014, Life After New Media.
2014. And there's just a world of space in those 3 or 4 years that I think are very significant for discussions of, media, essentially. And so 10 puts her in an interesting spot because you have the seeds of everything that we recognize and take as sort of the pillars of our media discussions, but they're not yet fully realized. And I think the one for me that I sort of use is Twitter, for example, right? Twitter, I think, is the darling of South by Southwest in like 2007. It certainly exists in 2010, but it doesn't really become a fixture of critical discourse until Arab Spring and Boston Marathon bombing, and these moments where it was really used organically, I guess, and that post dates her discussion here. So one of the tricky things for me was trying to figure out what to do with these arguments that don't quite line up with the other discussions that we've had. And I think one of the things that was particularly problematic was the theoretical position that Dean takes, not because she's wrong, but just because it's different. Here she leans into psychoanalysis, which, for full disclosure for everyone listening, that is not my bag. I'm familiar with it certainly, but it's not where I would go to explain media theory or how I would go to explain media theory. But the thing that I guess the sort of the place where I've landed here is that instead of looking at 2010 historically as a liability, I think the flip side of that coin is that it offers a sort of an interesting little time, like what's the word I'm looking for? A time capsule.
Yeah.
Where, we can sort of see where she is and then see what it looks like if we trace forward, 14, 15 years to 2024, or 2025 is the case may be here on the verge of that anyways, and see what that looks like.
I love it. I think we're poised to get started, but before you get started, and we're going to sort of we're going to rather carefully, I think, work through the first couple pages of chapter 1 of Dean's book, Blog Settings. But I wanted to add something in terms of the time capsule or the time difference. I wanted to
Hmm.
add another comment along the lines of the one you just mentioned about the in grappling with this particular moment, the particular moment of media and media theory that's represented by the book. Actually, I'll see if I can make 2 points briefly. The first point has to do with blogs. I mean, the title, blog theory. So blogs have kind of been replaced, right? Michael, help me on this. But it seems blogs are represent, and this is what Dean is trying to anatomize, is sort of an emergent form of what we would now recognize as media theory. But interestingly enough, blogs are kind of, I think, passe, and they've been made passe partly by Twitter and X, but also partly by the fact that by Substack, it seems like authors have become their own entrepreneurs, and they need subscribers. In other words, blog was more of the commons model of the
So
internet, and it seems to have been replaced by Substack, where we have more of the subscription monetized model of
I
education,
think that's right, but I
right?
think there's also something
Yeah,
else.
yeah, yeah.
Um, she's using the idea, and we're going to definitely get into this.
Hmm.
But so when she's talking about blogs, I see blog as really very early versions of social media in the multiple ways that we conceive of it now. Because I think in 2010, yes, your reference to Substack, the tie that you're drawing to Substack, absolutely right. But also, I think that the early days of blogging were much more participatory.
Yes,
And
right, right, right. It's about
and
posting on the blog,
it
right?
was, and
Right.
I think that in that context, so there's two things to think about with this that I think are significant. Um, and they're not necessarily related here. Well, they're certainly related, but they're not part of the same argument. The author of a blog or the owner of a blog, in many ways, functions also in a moderator position as opposed to just the author position. So
That's interesting.
the
That's
interaction, I
interesting.
think,
Yeah.
is much more
Yeah.
significant than the
Yeah.
other thing that she makes note of here. And this is sort of the idea of the promise of democracy with the blog, is that the context in which a blog exists is, we're going to get talking about her idea of reflexivity in a bit. But visibility is a substantial thing. So blogs that are financed by corporations are going to have a significantly larger degree of visibility
Hmm.
and therefore an outsized impact
Hmm.
on what she's calling the blogosphere,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Than little, individual or mom and pop style kind of blogs that are just, not funded by deep pockets that can't manipulate algorithms or dictate algorithms quite so well. So I think that you have two different arguments there that are very much relevant in 2010 in
Hmm.
ways that aren't anymore.
Hmm.
But I also think that's sort of some of the interesting, um, some of the more interesting elements of this discussion is trying to sort of
Hmm.
understand how, her one of her arguments here, right, is that this is moving so quickly that it's difficult
Right.
to theorize.
Right.
That's part of
Um,
the point. The shift in how we engage with these is very different. I'll resist my William Gibson quote for the billionth time, but that the evolution has been rapid. So I mean, do you want to just jump into it and start, or
I just want to add one more thing. No, but that was I hope that was helpful for listeners. That was a very helpful discussion because that's part of what we're trying. I loved your comments there because that's what I hope we're going to try to do this. But that's what we're trying to do this episode. We're trying to mark Dean's moment in history in terms of media theory and also think of it in dialectical relation to our own. So
Mhm.
you are helping me do that. I wanted to say try to do just a brief dialectical remark about her theoretical position. Now, so we were talking about media, but I want to say something about her theoretical position. You referred to her psychoanalytic. So she is basically using Zizek when Mr. Zizek was very much au courant and du jour and kind of the thing in critical and cultural studies. Um, um, and in particular, his kind of popularizing his application of psychoanalytic theory to popular culture, and in particular to media culture. Zizek is pretty has had a kind of a major influence, I think, on film studies. But less of an effect on media studies. But that's kind of what Dean was trying to do, is trying to apply psychoanalytic concepts a la Lacan and Zizek, and applying it to media theory. And I just wanted to say something about, I just wanted to try and historicize her gesture. I think one of the reasons why she finds the psychoanalytic framework so important in 2010 has something to do with the prior history of both media and media theory. And I'll try and explain briefly. So, both the internet in its first incarnation, Internet 1.0, was more of a commons than it
Hmm.
was a market.
Right.
And what you described it really, really nicely yesterday in our pregame show, Michael. You were talking about um, the free-thinking hippies in Silicon Valley. They had wrested away this incredible technology from the Pentagon, and now they were going to do it right. So there is all this sort of utopian counterculture dreaming that is associated with the concept and the reality of the internet in the late 90s into the 21st century. Now, what does this have to do with Dean and psychoanalytic theory and Zizek? Well, this that by 2010, now it's not 2024, but even by 2010, the idea that the internet constituted the greening of America, the idea that the internet would be able to remain a commons and not be influenced or formed or restructured by
Hmm.
market forces. The idea that 60s and 70s radical theorizing of communications, of new forms of communication, that could be adopted and enacted and, in fact, epitomized by media, by the internet in particular, and by social media in particular. That idea is seen, that I think that's the idea she's reacting against. She feels there are new political currents, and she feels that the internet does not automatically represent an anti-capitalist force. So part of the reason that she is using psychoanalytic theory is Jodi Dean is trying to show her distance from a kind of, at that point, complacent left assumption on the part of the left that the internet was always already a kind of subversive medium. And so by talking about psychoanalytic dynamics of the sort that you're going to be talking about right now, this is her way of talking about concepts, real life practice and embodiments of real life experiences with the internet. And these real life experiences and functionings of the internet, including blog cultures, including the blog, they can't be read in a necessarily left utopian way. And so that's why she's using her theory. I think that's the reason for this, what might seem a surprising media theoretic in her case. But I think it's warranted by her assessment of the politics of the occasion
So
and the changing politics of the internet.
I want you to clarify that for me for a second, because as I remember it, 2010, 2011. So right when this book would have been, you know, new and current and discussed, we were still talking about remix culture. We were talking about digital commons. That was still like
Mhm.
there was, I think it was a point in flux. And I think her discussion or her entry into this discussion would have been, I don't know. I don't want to say that are you saying that that moment was over, that the idealism was gone?
No, no, but I think she has some distance from that idea. No, I think that moment was in flux. I mean,
Hmm.
also when you think of 2010, and she mentions Obama, I mean, when you think of the immediate, uh, when you think of Obama, I mean, I remember, tell me if your memory tallies with mine, that there was I don't know how long this honeymoon lasted, but there was at least 6 months of Obama's election, in the wake of Obama's election, where we were talking about post-racial America, right?
Hmm.
Maybe even more than that. So that
Yeah.
would
I
have
mean,
been in 2010. So I'm not saying that utopian longings or dreams were there, but I would think that the 60s dream, I think that we are, I think she's on the cusp of a critique of those notions, right? I think 2 years later, um, left critics like Dean would be kind of, I think the new consensus solidify. Well, let me start again and see if I can say this thought clearly. 2010, I think she's ahead of the curve in suspecting the old left ideas may not be the best map for the internet. By 2012 or so, by 2014, I think there was a kind of consensus among left media theorists that we weren't in a post-racial society. We weren't in a post. We weren't moving toward a utopian commons on the internet.
no. Okay. I was curious as to how you were understanding her, because I agree with that. I think that in 10, 11, the optimism was still there. I think
I
this
think
I
she's ahead of the curve.
Yes. Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure we were understanding her from the same situation. Um, shall we start?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the plan is to just cherry pick a few passages that outline her position. We can talk through them, and then we can see how that lines up with where we are. All right. So I will do my best to read clearly for you. She says, and this is this is in the first paragraph of the introduction to the chapter. A problem specific to critical media theory is the turbulence of networked communications. That is, the rapidity of innovation, adoption, adaptation, and obsolescence. So she's basically arguing here that it is difficult to theorize this because it is a very, very quickly moving target. Fair?
Go ahead and read the next sentence because I think it's very much of a piece.
Okay,
The next marked
a
sentence.
theory that is current, if it is possible at all, seems confined to presentation within the forms and circuits it analyzes. So, as I understand that, she's basically saying everything is moving so quickly
That it's
that
hard to theorize it.
it's hard to theorize. And if you're going to theorize, you have to theorize around a particular moment. You can't. It's very difficult to
Mhm.
apply the theories in any sort of connective way. Okay, so let's. The side of the problem highlights one of the specific ways communicative capitalism captures critique and resistance, formatting them as contributions to the circuits in which it thrives. The temporal takeover of theory displaces sustained critical thought, replacing it with the sense that there isn't time for thinking, that there are only emergencies to which one must react, that one can't keep up and might as well not try. The second side of the problem, the form of theory's presentation, likewise highlights how communicative capitalism fragments thought into ever smaller bits, bits that can be distributed and sampled, even ingested and enjoyed, but that can, in the glut of multiple circulating contributions, tend to resist recombination into longer, more demanding theories.
Let me stop you there, Michael, because I just realized we left out the first part of this formula. And then I want to restore the first part of the formula. And
Certainly.
then I want to have you restate those points because I think we failed to highlight what she says about communicative capitalism and the blog. So let me give everyone the first missing bit, and then I want you to go back and hit those sentences again, and because they're descriptors of the
Yes.
missing bit.
Yes.
So here is the missing piece of the puzzle there. The starting bit is this. She thinks she wants, given the difficulties of theorizing the moment in the internet, given that the internet's moment is so quick, right? And that internet culture is an example of an incredibly shifting culture. To talk about the blog, as she's doing, requires us to think about the functions, how the blog is functioning, and in its mobile possibilities on the internet. And so she says, let's think of the mod. So in order to do this, she says, let's think of the blog as an example of communicative capitalism. By that, she means a kind of mode of communication that is meant to function within the marketplace of the internet, right? So that's communicative capitalism. The blog is a form of communicative capitalism. That seems like that's the first thought here. And then it seemed I thought you were reading her descriptions of communicative capitalism. Let me do it just
Hmm.
quickly. You'll stop me or amend. Please stop and amend me as I go through it. But I'm just putting the pieces together of what you read. So, what's a blog? Communicative capitalism, which means it's a form of communication that can fit within the new economic structure, the new thought structure of the internet. Okay. What are the features of this communicative capitalism? One of the features is that if you have a blog, it's a way of thinking without having, as in the passage you read, it's a way of thinking that displaces, quote, I'm quoting Dean here, as you did. It's a mode of thinking, a form of communicative capitalism that, quote, displaces sustained critical thought, replacing it with the sense that there isn't time for thinking. What's another feature of the blog is communicative capitalism? It fragments thoughts, as you read, into smaller bits.
So,
And also the other bit you read, and then I'm done. Um, because the blog breaks everything down into bite-sized bits, uh, it embodies a mode of thought, or it exemplifies a kind of, quote, resistance to recombination of thought into longer, more demanding theories, unquote. Okay, let's
so
discuss.
I have an interesting, I think it's interesting question for you about this, right? The argument here is that, as I understand her, she's saying that the form of this
Indeed,
is really affecting our ability to engage and
that
to
is
think.
exactly it. Oh my God, do we have a point where we can mention McLuhan here? Because I think we can,
Yeah,
because
go.
she is saying that the form of the blog is its content, which is a way of thinking that, in a sense, keeps us from recombining ideas into longer demanding, more demanding
And
theories.
so
A
here's
way of thinking that fragments thoughts into
right.
ever smaller
And
bits.
this is fascinating because this is not, even if we push McLuhan to the side for just a moment, this is not a new thought, right? This is like, I
Hmm.
think it was Nicholas Carr was the most famous person who argued, with
Hmm.
the is Google making us stupid, that the internet
Hmm.
and reading on the
Hmm.
internet is really
Hmm.
forcing us into smaller chunks of thought. That long form thought and conversation is becoming more difficult. But what's interesting to me about this, and this gets back to the little discussion we had earlier about sort of how we see Dean. The communicative capitalism in 2010, this is still sort of pre-marketplace, we're still very much in the commons here, aren't
Are we
we?
kind of, is that, my memory, this is not a rhetorical question. I'm trying to remember. I think it was a little bit of both.
Well, that's my point. Yes.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that there wasn't a
Hmm.
marketplace,
Hmm.
but we still had, I think there was still this idea
Hmm.
that these
We still have a
were,
commons idea for sure. Yeah.
yes. And so the idea that this is framed as as communicative capitalism, I find interesting.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that well, anyways, I think we certainly have we've managed to
Is this
see.
more? Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, it seems like maybe what you just said is more evidence that, this was what I was struggling to say earlier when you were asking me, were counterculture dreams dead? And I said, well, no, but she
No, but
seems
it's
to
she's
be seeing
prescient
past it. Yeah.
yeah, she's realizing that I think this is where this could go.
Yeah, yeah. But I was, and that's what I was going to say. Is this not another moment where she seems to be prescient?
Well, it's fascinating to me because, so we get Saint Marshall in here with the idea that, hey, the form of this medium is that the content is the form, right? Like this is all about short form, um, what's the word I'm looking for here? Sorry, fragmented sort of bits and pieces, right? And what we also see here is that this is a form that is in flux. It is about, or it is in the process of shifting in many ways, for at least in terms of the meaningful actors, it is going to shift from
Hmm.
a commons
Hmm.
to a marketplace. And I think that's
Hmm.
so. This is a really fascinating thing where you see not just that the internet itself is sort of evolving, but that as the internet is evolving, so too then is the communicative form of the internet evolving.
I think that go ahead and read the next passage you marked off, Dr. Rapici, because I think it's still making the form content groove
Yeah, this
thing.
is holding up well here. Um, as multiple recombinant ideas and images circulate, stimulate, they distract us from the antagonisms constitutive of contemporary society, inviting us to think that each opinion is equally valid, each option is equally likely, and each click is a significant political intervention. The
Okay.
deluge of images and announcements enjoining us to react, to feel, to forward them to our friends erodes critical theoretical capacities. Aren't they really just opinions, anyways? Feelings dressed up in jargon? Drowning in plurality, we lose the capacity to grasp anything like a system, react and forward, but don't by any means think. So let's just stop there before we
Mhm.
finish out this little bit here. This is really, I think, her articulation of this is what the medium requires, that this is that we are not only dissuaded from thinking, but the rationale and the logic that this is a personal medium. It's not something that we necessarily have to take too seriously or think about. Like by couching it as this um, subjective sort of framework, we
Hmm.
I don't know, we can do what we and I think this is actually important a little bit down the line. We can kind of do what we want with the content.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Okay.
Now, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
Did
I
I
was gonna
cut
say
you off?
if you wanted to add more, I kind of wanted to take a moment to talk about that before we get into this last big bit.
Please do.
I'm done. Or did you want to add to it or
No, no,
okay.
I'm anxious to move to the next paragraph, but before you do, I wanted to sort of characterize it. Now, what you just read struck me as part of this critique of the blog as communicative capitalism. Now, what surprises me about the next paragraph, which I want you to read, and which you marked off to read, we agree that you would read. Now, Michael, it seems like my reading of the paragraph in advance, I want you to read it, but I'm just going to let me announce my reading in advance because I want us to comment on it. The next paragraph, as I understand it, she wants to take it back and saying, hey, I know there are all these criticisms that we can levy at the blog, level at the blog, but it's worth thinking about the blog and taking it seriously. And it's worth writing a book about the blog. I'm going to announce my position in advance and before you read the paragraph, but then I want us to both return it to it. I think that Dean is really prescient in all the ways we're talking about in her analysis of the problems of the blog. And that if you stick with her critical analysis, you can draw a straight line from 2010 to 2024. But I think that means I'll have to ignore or confute or refute everything you're about to read. But let's
Okay.
see. Let's see
Okay.
it. Let's see if I'm right or wrong on that. Let's see how it holds up.
Okay. She says, my wager is that critical media theory is possible in book form. The wager is inspired by time-honored tactic in workers' struggle, the slowdown. As an object whose form installs delays in sampling and syndication and whose content demands postponed gratification, the book mobilizes the gap of mediacy so as to stimulate thought.
Hmm.
Ebooks and articles, as well as blog posts on theoretical topics, are convenient ways to store and share ideas. But these benefits come at a cost. We
Hmm.
pay with attention.
Hmm.
It's easy to give into the temptation to keep moving, to follow links, to see what others think about it before one even knows what, quote, it might be, and then to
Hmm.
see what else others are thinking about, especially if their posts aren't too long. And once we're already a few clicks in, why not go ahead and check our blog status, update our Facebook profiles, and engage in a few rounds of Mafia Wars or other games helpfully supplied by our favorite social network? It only takes a minute or two.
Oh my gosh, Michael. That paragraph, I am I wrong? That paragraph might as well be taken from Fahrenheit 451. Is not that paragraph, is that's just a defense of the book, any book, against all other mediums? She's saying
Well,
I can write a book of media theory because it's a book and it's not a blog, and that
so
allows me critical space to reply on the blog.
I think I have a little bit of an issue with this. Yes, you
I think I have a lot of issue with this.
right.
Yeah.
So she starts out, we didn't read the beginning of this, but she's basically saying, well, how is it that I can write a book about why
Yeah.
choose this medium?
Yeah.
Right. And so here's the defense of it, that it's going to slow you down.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know. This doesn't do a whole lot for me in terms of, um, I think, well, let me hear what you had. Let me respond to you rather than try and find my words here.
Well, I mean, I thought what this, I had misread this paragraph or misremembered this paragraph. I thought she was going to go from this to from her criticism of the form of communicative capitalism embodied by or exemplified by the blog into a discussion of why thinking about the blog has critical potential. But looking at this paragraph again, what I'm getting is just a kind of binary. She's setting up a binary between internet writing, which she calls communicative capitalism,
Right.
and then the book. How is a book not communicative capitalism?
Well, I
Can you
think
talk of
it's
print capitalism? Of course you
no.
can,
So
right?
here's the thing. As I understand this argument, she's saying, look, the problem with the internet, blog writing, and the like
Mm-hmm.
is that it resists focus and thought, right?
Okay.
And that the form is going to encourage distraction. It's going to encourage consumption
Indeed,
without consideration, we'll say.
indeed, indeed.
So
Right,
while you're reading this online, then check the link, do this, you can
right,
get distracted.
right,
In other
right.
words, to use, I don't know that this analogy works, but it's sort of like saying, look, you're in the car and you got the window seat, and look at how wonderful and distracted it is. And you're going to pay attention to all these other things. It's like she offers you the closet where you can sit and there is nothing to look at. And by God, because you have no distractions, then you must read this book.
Mhm.
And if you can't have a window to look out of, if there is nobody to distract you, then you will read it and you will understand it.
Mhm.
And that's, I mean, I could be misreading it, but that seems to be what she's saying, is that the book,
Mhm.
the postponed gratification, there's this sort of, I don't know, there's no other option. You're stuck, therefore you must read it, as if people don't put books down and walk away when they become annoying or
Well,
distracting for some
you
reason.
just undid her argument by saying that, right? I
Well, I
mean,
don't, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going here, and I think she sees a lot of things really well. This particular line of thought does, I don't,
okay.
maybe I'm missing it, but it seems to me that she's basically
I may be
defending books
emphasizing,
because
yeah,
there's
probably put emphasis on a passage that we shouldn't let's move on.
okay, I'm gonna, yeah, I don't know. I take the position that contemporary communications media capture their users in intensive and extensive networks of enjoyment, production, and surveillance. My term for this formation is communicative capitalism, right?
Okay,
So
now we're talking about the blogs.
communicative capitalism is being wrapped up in all of this sort of wonderful stuff that we get. The capitalism, we become, we are surveilled, we're watched, like we're willing
Mhm.
to, this is the origin of also privacy issues, I guess, here, or an early version of privacy concerns.
Mhm.
Just
Mhm.
as industrial capitalism relied on the exploitation of labor, so does communicative capitalism rely on the exploitation of communication.
Mhm.
As Michael Hart and Antonio Negri argue, quote, communication is the form of capitalist production in which capital has succeeded in submitting society entirely and globally to its regime, suppressing all alternative paths. A critical theory of communicative capitalism requires occupying, rather than disavowing, the trap in which it enthralls and configures contemporary subjects. I argue that this trap takes the form of modern European philosophy heralded as the form of freedom, colon,
Mhm.
reflexivity. Communicative capitalism is that economic ideological form wherein reflexivity captures creativity and resistance so as to enrich the few as it placates and diverts the many. There's a lot going on there.
Lot going on here. Maybe we should go. Maybe we should go back to the first bit on page 4, which is where you kind of began reading, and then and talk about that a little bit, and then maybe we can finish the episode by talking about that last sentence about reflexivity.
Right.
And
So my understanding of this, right? She says, I take the position that contemporary communication media, so this is
so
blogs,
that's the
but this
blog.
is also mafia wars and other games and Facebook,
Sure,
everything. This is right.
sure.
Capture their users in intensive and extensive networks of enjoyment, production, and surveillance, right?
Mhm.
So this is that clicking through and following through. This is all of the
Mhm.
diversion, right?
Mhm.
There is the enjoyment. We are also being surveilled. This is the beginning of big data started to be a thing about this time, right? And so she's concerned with this. This is communicative capitalism. This is where in these communicative moments that we understand as one thing, she's arguing, I guess there's like a darker, slightly more insidious side to this. As industrial capitalism relied on the exploitation of labor, so does
Mhm.
communicative capitalism rely on the exploitation of communication.
Mhm.
Okay. As Hart and Negri argue,
Mhm.
quote,
Mhm.
communication is the form of capitalist production in which capital has succeeded in submitting society entirely and globally to its regime, suppressing all alternative paths. In other words, we have crossed that tipping point. This is where we play. This is what we do. Yes?
Yeah, and actually, that the passage you read explains. I guess it gets darker. The final passage that ends this section, it gets darker still because basically she says that. Um, well, I'll read that and sort of give it a quick gloss. I argue that this trap of communicative
Capitalism.
capitalism takes the form that modern European philosophy heralded as a form of freedom, reflexivity. Communicative capitalism is that economic ideological form wherein reflexivity captures creativity and resistance so as to enrich the few as it placates and diverts the many. So this passage is an extension of the passage that you read. And like I said, it's a darkening of it. Um, so that to the, say, liberal critic who says, wait a minute, blogs aren't, or Facebook isn't about enjoyment, production, and surveillance. It isn't this ambiguous triad. No, it's a mode of reflexive, interactive participation. And Dean's grim response or realist response is no, what you are calling reflexivity, intellectual reflexivity, or interaction or freedom is only, and creative activity on the net isn't this, it's an illusion of freedom.
You know, it's fascinating because I think that this moment right here very much addresses our discussion earlier about the shift from the commons to the marketplace,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what's happening. Her understanding of communicative capitalism is saying, look, yes, freedom, you go where you want, you read what you want, you click what you want, enjoyment, engagement, you play these games, you do these things. But the idea here is because all of this is networked,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
your
Yes,
freedom,
exactly.
your freedom
Yeah.
is still a version of 24. I mean, this is 24/7. You're working and supplying someone else with
Right.
data,
Right.
which in relatively short order is going to create that marketplace that you are going to both fund and pay for. You're going to supply the
Yeah.
content, which you are then going to turn around and end up paying for.
Yeah.
Um,
This is these two passages reinforce each other, and they are I would say, the left critique of a liberal idea of the internet or libertarian
well,
idea of the internet, right?
this is I think the early days of what neoliberalism, right? Like where
Right.
the
Right.
market shifts.
Right.
And we're doing this under this notion. So reflexivity is interesting. I think that if you look at the last line here, right, communicative capitalism is that economic ideological form wherein reflexivity captures creativity and resistance so as to enrich the few as it placates and diverts the many,
Neoliberalism, you're right.
right?
She's
So
tagging that, right?
we're pacified and we're distracted as we supply the content that we will then crave. So the question that I guess we want to get to here is, what does this look like if we work backwards from 2024, or do we work this forwards from 2010 to 24? There's this is the more that we talk through this, Barry, the more kind of on point this seems to be.
So and that's what I was going to say, is our question now, is 2010 any different from 2024 or vice versa?
Well,
Is that really our question? Is
she
that our
does
question?
one other interesting thing here that I think
Mhm.
is worth talking about.
Mhm.
She talks about the myth of the democratic idea behind the blog.
Mhm.
And she invokes Habermas and talks about the public sphere
Mhm.
and how, for Habermas, this is supposed to be this sort of place for rational debate. And on the surface, it would seem that a blog functions in this way, right? It's a public space where people talk. But her argument is interesting. She says it's not this at all. And the problem with the blog, as she sees it, is that it is decentralized and it is very individual. And so while it has some of the hallmarks of a public sphere, the reality is that in this sort of reflexive relationship to other things rather than being a true public where there's dissent. Dissenting voices are run out, and these blogs sort of become echo chambers where whatever is on the table is reinforced. And I think this explains the heavy lean into psychoanalysis, because what's happening is that as we're leaning into and reinforcing so many disparate ideas and positions, we're creating safe spaces for these identities to exist. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? So, if I have a thing for waffles shaped like chickens, right? I'm gonna find something, or if I don't, I'm gonna start a blog about it and people are gonna find me. If this is something darker, if it's a corporate funded and therefore bigger and more effective in terms of both the algorithm and just vision, like visibility, right? We're going to be more readily seen. We're going to have a greater influence on the population that comes to us, that we can control these dialogue, these discussions more effectively.
Hmm.
You create little sort of islands of discussion as opposed to islands of agreement as opposed to a public sphere. And so I think that's why we have so much psychoanalysis, is because this is really the development of so many different identities, so many different selves. And the again, not really my thing, but my understanding, the reason why Lacan is here and factors so prevalently, right, is because this is us learning to see ourselves, learning to identify with others who are like us, and establishing an identity that we feel comfortable standing in.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I'll take the jump and say, if you look at this and say, well, what's happened in the past couple of years? What's happening now with such a divided country, but concretely standing on my position that this is right and I am right and I have, if necessary, aggressive rights to my position. And I think this is for the left and the right. Um, I don't think it's hard to trace a line from her understanding of what reflexivity actually means underneath or alongside communicative capitalism in a world that is shifting away from engaged thought, that's not really caring to or even able to engage with anything longer than hyperlinks and then blurbs and then captions and then just images. Um, this actually tracks really, really well.
I have nothing to add to your wonderful summary statement. That's
Oh,
beautiful.
Barry, you're supposed to fight me and disagree with
No,
me on
not
that.
at all. I
It's
think that's a
it's
wonderful. I like how you drew a not so crooked line, a pretty straight line from 2010's fragmentation to the multi-fragmentation of 2024, where we should be. I mean, we'll put it another way, or slightly to just what you said. Um, Whether or not something like psychoanalysis, we need something like psychoanalysis to describe the process that Dean and you are trying to describe, of the construction of subject positions, these niche subject positions that are being constructed. They are fomented by desire, right? The
mhm,
the key psychoanalytic term, right? It's desire, the pursuit of individual desire that is leading to the articulation or construction of subjecthood. But that also means kind of the opposite of the Habermasian public sphere, right?
mhm.
Because it's about, I don't know, micro discussions. Like you have micro public spheres
Well,
instead
I
of
think
a
it's instead
public sphere or commons.
it's the water cooler instead of the public sphere,
Yes, right, right,
right? And it's
right.
it's it's fascinating because you understand, like, again, I think it was a bit of work to get here, But I think that when we look at her argument in this way, it really is pretty fascinating because you see, again, using McLuhan as sort of the medium being the message, this shift from this optimistic commons to this neoliberalism that we've talked about before, but how effectively desire is manipulated.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean, this.
And the other reason to use psychoanalysis is that you're right to say desire is being deployed and manipulated. But at the same time, I think you think that we are following our desires when we partake, when we go online, that we're following our desires, that we're fulfilling them, and that we're being, to use the terms that you read in that last passage that you read, we're being creative. We're being resistant to other identities and affiliating to the identities that we choose to identify with.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's really it's kind of terrifying.
Well, that just means that welcome to the hellscape of November 27th, 2024. I
I
think
love
I
it.
think we have that's the end
Are
of
we
our
done?
Thanksgiving edition
We're not
of
going to even try. There's that's it. We're done. Um, Barry, I will say this is one of those interesting texts where uh, I come out of this discussion in a very different place than I came into it, and I think that that's it's encouraging because it means that at least for a couple days, you and I have resisted the uh, tendencies put upon us by the internet to actually engage in some thought.
yeah.
Um, but it makes for, I think, a much more rewarding conversation. I don't I like sometimes poking my head at me like, wow, I'm in a different place than I thought I was.
Mhm, mhm.
This is a much more interesting argument than it seemed at first, and I'm grateful for
Well,
that.
I'm grateful to you, Michael, for making me patient and taking me through this. So I feel I also too took a journey with this essay, and that's a very, very good thing. Let me end, but typically it's Barry Falk. Let me end with a negative note. Uh, Not about the journey and not about Dean,
Yeah.
but just about one critical thing. So uh, like I said, I want to reiterate, I'm grateful to you for making me, for carving a new path through the essay. And I feel I'm more tolerant and appreciative of both her approach and the need for psychoanalysis for this kind of media analysis, but also the cogency of her concept of communicative capitalism. But that one paragraph that we stumbled on, that I stumbled on especially, that still worries me.
About the
Uh,
about the book
yeah.
being
Yeah, I don't think I can get around that because that strikes me for such a sophisticated critic. That struck me as a pretty untheorized binary between book. I mean, I like books too. I mean, if it's a matter of the John Stuart Mill decided preference among things, right?
Mhm.
As a way of deciding a value, I'm all for books. So I'm on her side. And I do feel that books can stimulate a kind of concentrated, um, actually, I'll also point to our friend, another friend of the show, Theodore Adorno,
Mhm.
who made kind of a similar point and, against his better judgment about like
The
long playing
records.
records, right?
I'll say this. I see where you're going with this. I agree that her articulation and defense of the book, I think, is clumsy.
Yeah, yeah,
But I will say that there's something there.
yeah. No, I agree. I
And
guess I was going to say
so
the other
I
way.
think
Yeah,
that
yeah, the other way.
maybe if we bring Saint Marshall back in for a second,
Mhm.
what she's really saying is that when you hold a physical artifact in your hands, when you flip the pages, that the engagement with the medium prompts a different sort of engagement. and yields a different response than you could have if you were digital. And I do buy that. So I think I agree. I am not comfortable with the way that that paragraph read, but I think that the idea behind it holds water.
And where she goes to in terms of the critique of communicative capitalism, that just seems prescient in all manner of ways, as you were discussing.
Mm-hmm. I like it.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Very same to you. Everyone, thank you for listening. And I'll talk to you after the break.
Take care.
All right, Barry.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.